Okay, everyone, we are back again to read more of Money, Power, and Sex, the Lori Vallow Daybell trial by juror number 18, Tom Evans. And I want to dedicate these next few chapters to Crusher K. Easton of Difficult Research. I think if she can find a way to get a hold of this Tom Evans, he might just get the answers he's looking for. But you'll see what I'm talking about as we move forward. Chapter 10, Who is Chad Daybell? Who is Chad Daybell? What is his background? What was his standing in the Mormon church? How did he get Lori Vallow Daybell and others to believe in his BS? Why do his 5 children still believe he's innocent? Could he have been framed by Lori and her brother Alex? Was he obsessed with death? Chad Guy Daybell was born on August 11th of 1968 in Provo, Utah, to parents Jack and Sheila Daybell. He grew up in Springville, Utah, and Chad Daybell served as a missionary in New Jersey for the Mormon Church from July 1987 to 1989. Trent Price, a fellow missionary, called him a gentle giant and said Chad Daybell was soft-spoken, but that people were drawn to him. In August of 1985, when Chad Daybell was 17, he jumped off a cliff into the Flaming Gorge Reservoir. He talked about that leap changing the trajectory of his life. He claims to have fallen into another dimension. When he hit the water, he felt a snap and thought he broke his neck. He felt a white light and could feel his spirit leaving his body. But his spirit was snagged on something and couldn't leave. It was unable to fully detach. A new world opened up around him, and he called it the other side of the veil. And he saw an endless white plain spreading in all directions. He said there was music and it was warm. Finally, a friend swam out and pulled him to safety. In his book, Living on the Edge of Heaven, he says it was his first near-death experience. Near-death experiences play a huge role in not only Chad Daybell's life, but in many of the leaders of his prepper world. People who claim to have had near-death experiences were thought to be closer to God. Having a near-death experience puts them above everyone else because they would have knowledge that others didn't have. After his near-death experience, life went back to normal for Chad Daybell. He played high school baseball and excelled in his studies. He earned a scholarship to Brigham Young University and graduated from there with a degree in communications. Chad Daybell was an extremely successful missionary, converting hundreds of people to the Mormon faith. The Mormon Church sends tens of thousands of young missionaries all over the world every year. I'm sure you've seen the young men in white shirts and black ties on bicycles. Chad Daybell's mission was in New Jersey, and he doesn't have much good to say about the state. He describes seeing a lot of crime and claims to have been shot at. Apparently, that didn't qualify as a near-death experience. His time in New Jersey reinforced his view that Mormon country was where he wanted to spend his life. I totally get that. Whatever else you want to say about southeast Idaho and rural Utah, it is way more civilized. Less traffic, room to breathe, polite people, open land, a sense of security and safety, and just an all-around relief after spending time in a place like New Jersey. In early 1989, Chad Daybell met Tammy Douglas, and the two were engaged by Thanksgiving. Their engagement photos were taken at the Springville Cemetery. That's not a place most of us would think of taking our engagement photos, but Chad was said to be consumed with death even in his younger days. Chad Daybell's second near-death experience happened in 1993 while on vacation with Tammy and his brother in La Jolla, California. He claims he was overwhelmed by the tide while swimming in the ocean. While clinging to a rock, he heard voices and saw a tunnel of light, and 2 figures appeared. They were his Utah ancestors. They asked him if he would do 2 tasks, and he replied yes. At that moment, he came back into his body and tumbled back to shore, bloody and in need of stitches. I'm not sure what the two tasks were, but I would guess they had something to do with leading his chosen people after the second coming of Christ. He said, "My personal veil had been opened even wider this time. It didn't close up nearly as much as it had after my Flaming Gorge experience." He believed he had a personal connection to the spirit world. He would go on to use this belief or this claim to influence people around him, telling them he received information that no one else was privy to. We all have a voice in our heads, but we call it our conscience. Chad Daybell always claims that the voice in his head is some spirit angel, Jesus or Moroni speaking directly to him. According to the Mormon Church, Moroni is the angel who visited Joseph Smith and was the guardian of the golden tablets the Book of Mormon is based on. You can see a golden statue of Moroni facing the rising sun to the east on the top of any Mormon temple. If nothing else, Chad is an interesting person. He authored several books with subjects ranging from prayer to the end of times. In court, Lori Daybell's attorney, Jim Archibald, called the book stupid and said Chad Daybell had weird beliefs. I confess, I haven't read most of them fully and don't feel the need to. I did start to read one, but got so bored after 15 to 20 pages that I had to quit. It reads like a children's story, but was obviously meant for adults. I've heard others say they are poorly written and not exactly convincing. It did make me wonder, though, whether Chad Daybell was simple, or was he maybe just that smart? Was he maybe writing his books in a way that would indicate to him which people were naive and idealistic enough to follow him? In other words, if someone read his books and came to him saying they liked what they read, that would mean that person must be a sucker or a potential victim. He was also a podcaster focusing on extreme beliefs, and I have the same questions about the people who followed his podcasts. Chad Daybell did seem to have thousands of followers. He claims to have been the prophet James in a previous life, or he called it a previous probation. He claimed to believe the end of the world would happen in July of 2020 and the 12 tribes of Israel would survive. One of the books I tried to read was about life after July 2020. It was all about how the Mormons came together, giving over everything to the church, and the church was an extremely benevolent, seemingly unendingly rich benefactor. All of a sudden, things like solar power had been figured out by the Mormons and powered everything from factories to houses, and somehow people were able to travel around effortlessly. He didn't explain how that worked. Maybe electric cars powered by the solar panels, maybe? Before becoming the leader of a doomsday cult, he had been a gravedigger and cemetery sexton in good standing with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Although even then some thought that he might be too obsessed with death. He thought he should be not only the bishop of his ward, but even the president of the whole Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He really seemed to have believed that he should lead the whole Mormon church. Through his writings and podcasts, he somehow gained a large following. Of course, one of his followers was Lori. He talked a lot about the end of times and preparing for it. He convinced his followers that he had been the prophet James in a previous life and he had walked with Jesus. He convinced them that their path to salvation was through him. There was only 144,000 people that would survive the coming apocalypse, and those would be his followers. They would be centered around Rexburg, Idaho. Why would someone want to be the leader of a bunch of people who were so naive except to take advantage of them? Would you want to lead a bunch of people around who believed in impossible things? I wouldn't. I wouldn't want the responsibility. He also believed, or said he believed, that people could be possessed. and that the way to save them was to kill them so that their souls could be free of whatever demonic spirit, or as he called them, zombies, had entered their bodies. He called this casting, or casting out of the evil spirits. There were different levels of possession, and he rated people on a light or dark scale. This light or dark scale was a prominent subject in the trial because it led to all of the murders. Tammy, Charles, Tylee, and JJ all were said to be dark by Chad Daybell. In fact, not only dark, but moving even lower on the dark scale. He used this scale to manipulate people. You wouldn't want him to say you were dark. That would mean you were possessed, and that would put you in danger. It appears that the more you were liked by him, the higher your number would be on the light scale. And since he was your savior, that would be pretty important. If you did what he said you should do, you would get a higher rating from him. This sounds eerily similar to blood atonement. Blood atonement was a term used by some early Mormons. The idea was that the only way one could atone for one's sins was to shed his blood upon the ground as a sacrificial offering. In other words, a person would have to be killed to atone for his sins and make it to heaven. Chad Daybell convinced Lori that they had been married in a previous life or probation, and that her name had been Elena. They were to lead the chosen 144,000 to the promised land. This seems to be a line used by other men in the prepper community, or at least at the Preparing a People conferences. It seems like it wasn't very hard to convince her, since she already had similar beliefs. Chad Daybell and Lori were even somehow sealed in the Mormon church. Being sealed is similar to being married, but in the Mormon faith, sealing means you are joined for eternity. You'll move on to the celestial kingdom together. Not sure how that happened for Chad Daybell and Lori, but it was not an official sealing accepted by the Mormon church. Did they sneak in and do it while no one was looking? Chad Daybell was a prophet, or so he thought, so he would have had the authority to do a sealing even if it was his own and Lori's. They were actually legally married on a beach in Kauai. There are pictures of this event showing the couple dressed in white, wearing the malachite rings Lori had ordered on Amazon, and Chad Daybell playing a ukulele. Interestingly, malachite was used to ward off evil in ancient Egypt, and many cultures believed that malachite stones protected children from evil spirits. I don't believe they knew this. It's hard to say how Chad Daybell convinced Lori of the things he convinced her of. Did she believe it, or was it a way for her to gain stature and power? He definitely had a way of twisting scripture and making his version sound believable to some. Maybe the Chad Daybell trial will shed more light. Chad was officially excommunicated from the Mormon Church in 2020. I can't find any good explanation for that, so my assumption is that the Mormon Church could no longer afford to be associated with him because of his extreme beliefs. They did not, however, excommunicate him until Tylee and JJ's bodies were found buried in the backyard. Perhaps by that time they had simply had enough. A lot of people believe in Chad and Lori right up until JJ and Tylee's bodies were found. The idea was that the government was once again overreaching its authority and that Lori had good reasons to hide her children. I'm told Chad Daybell's 5 children still profess his innocence. They say he was taken in by Lori and he was framed. They don't believe he would have ever been stupid enough to bury Tylee and JJ on his own property, and that if he had, he would have dug better graves. After all, he had been a professional grave digger, but then who would have dug the graves, and how would Chad Daybell not have known about it? The property I live on is the exact same size as Chad Daybell's, and if someone dug a big hole in my yard, I would know. One could almost go along with the argument that Chad Daybell was taken in by Lori, though. He's not the smartest guy, and he definitely was in awe of Lori. He called her his goddess, and looking at him, one would have to believe he felt pretty fortunate to attract any woman who could be considered good-looking. The evidence is damning, however, and I think his defense will have a hard time convincing anyone he was taken by her, especially after Lori Daybell's guilty verdict. Still, one could make an argument that Alex and Lori were actually running things and Chad was duped. It was Alex's phone that was at the grave when Tylee and JJ were buried. It was Alex who was last seen with JJ alive. It was Alex who admitted to the police to killing Lori's husband, Charles. And Alex's phone was known to be at the church right down the street from Tammy and Chad's house the night of her death. If only Alex could speak. Sitting in the courtroom listening to testimony, I asked myself, if there was a connection with Chad Daybell to polygamy. I was listening to see if there would be any reference to the FLDS, but that never came up. Heather Daybell, Chad Daybell's sister-in-law, says she thinks Chad might have been a polygamist or at least a wannabe polygamist. She believes that because of his upbringing and his lack of respect for women, it was easy for him to exploit them for his own pleasure. We know a lot of his followers were women, and we know most of his closest followers were women who fell for what he was saying. Did he have sexual relationships with them? I've heard people close to Chad Daybell say they suspected it, but the only way we would ever know for sure is if one of those women came forward, and so far, that hasn't happened. Chapter 11, Cults. Chad Daybell was definitely running a cult. It may not have been as sophisticated as some of the other cults we know of, but he claimed the end of times were near and people needed to follow him in order to survive what was coming. The more I learn about cults, preppers, and the Mormon Church, the more I realize there are ties. It's all still going on in spite of what has happened with Chad Daybell. The common thread is that the Mormon Church, even though the Mormon Church constantly warns its parishioners against falling into these groups, it seems to be most prevalent in southern Utah and Arizona. On the surface, at least, it's all about fundamentalism, the end times, the second coming of Christ, and preparing for it all. What it's really all about is taking advantage of gullible people. And in Chad Daybell's case, what was really happening was that Chad Daybell was victimizing vulnerable people, especially women. Where did he find these people? The Mormon Church. It's pretty simple, really. Any intelligent person could start a cult. You just have to be smarter than your victims and willing to exploit them. Put out a premise that is ridiculous and see who falls for it. Those are your targets and your victims and your followers. Some people say the Mormon Church is a cult. I would not say that, but I can kind of see why they would say it, especially when you look into the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Not the Angel of Moroni and the Golden Tablets and all of that, but the factual written history of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and others. Mormons are taught that their faith is more important and more true than anything an outsider or Gentile might say. You're taught to put your questions on a shelf. In other words, put them out of your mind and trust in the church and its teachings. I'm not picking on the Mormon Church. I have a lot of good friends who are Mormon, and I respect them and their faith. I do, however, have to point out the truths, and the truth is that a lot of the Mormons I know who are otherwise very well educated don't have a good grasp on the actual history of the church. On January 19th of 1841, Joseph Smith declared himself to be a prophet, the first prophet of the Mormon religion. His message was that you needed to follow him in order to be saved. Joseph's wisdom was handed down straight from God. Mormons believe that true prophets can speak to God and to the angels, or at least get visions from them. They believe there can be only one living prophet. All other churches are wrong. Of course, Joseph and his followers were persecuted. For the first 30 or so years of their existence, they were treated horribly. They built whole communities, investing their lives in their homes, businesses, and farms, and they were violently run out of their communities they had built until they finally settled in Salt Lake Valley, where, for the most part, the church thrived under Joseph's successor, Brigham Young. Brigham Young had taken over the church and become the one true prophet after Joseph Smith was murdered by a mob in Carthage, Illinois in June of 1844. 6 years earlier, Missouri Governor Wilburn Boggs issued the Extermination Order of 1838, ordering the murder of all Mormons living in the area. Yeah, that order actually happened, and by all Mormons, he meant men, women, and children. The Mormons were stripped of any weapons they had by the non-Mormon citizens, and they gathered at Hahn's Mill for safety. When the militia showed up, the Mormon women and children fled into the woods, and the men gathered in the blacksmith shop. The blacksmith shop was a log building, and the logs had gaps big enough to allow the militiamen to poke their rifles through. 100 rifle barrels were shoved through the logs and fired, killing 17 Mormon men. Later, the wounded and 3 children were shot in cold blood. A militia man known as Glaze of Carroll County put the muzzle of his rifle to the back of a child's head and blew off the top of it. Later, a militia man by the name of William Reynolds justified the brutal murder, saying, "Nits will make lice." This incident was probably the worst atrocity suffered by the Mormons at the hands of the Gentiles, but certainly not the only one. There were interesting characters and events that occurred in the early days of the settlement of Salt Lake Valley. The church still doesn't like to talk about the Mountain Meadows massacre, but no longer denies that it happened. In Wyoming, back in the days of immigration along the California Trail, the trail split. Travelers could take the more northern route through Idaho with a stop at Fort Boise to resupply, or they could veer south through the Salt Lake Valley. As the Mormons settled the valley, it became a better place for wagon trains to restock. Although Brigham Young controlled the sale of supplies and kept prices high, the supplies were often desperately needed, and the immigrants were willing to pay the price for them. The trailhead would be extremely difficult through the desert and over the Sierra Nevada mountains before dropping down into the Sacramento Valley. All of this after having survived weeks prodding their mules or oxen across the prairie where supplies dwindled and wagons and gear wore out. So many of the wagon trains chose to go to Salt Lake for restocking. In 1857, the Baker Fancher party that originated in Arkansas took the Mormon road. Their wagons needed repairs, their supplies needed restocking, and their oxen were wore out. It was bad timing because the Mormons in Salt Lake were on edge. Brigham Young had declared martial law as President Buchanan had sent a military expedition to Salt Lake, and the Mormons were afraid they would be forced from their homes and farms once again. They had good reason to think this, given what had happened to them in the recent past, and they were determined to make their last stand in the Salt Lake Valley. They settled it, they tamed it, and they figured they had a right to it. While it was still a territory at the time, they would have to learn to live by the laws of the United States. That meant no more polygamy. Brigham Young refused to supply the Baker Fancher wagon train. Young's word was law in Salt Lake, and he put the word out that no one was to sell supplies to the party. In spite of the fact they were a relatively rich wagon train and desperately needed the supplies, they had no choice but to move on. After the Baker Fancher wagon train left Salt Lake on the way to Mountain Meadows, it was said that they had poisoned a spring, resulting in the death of Mormon cattle and people who had eaten the poisoned cattle. There is no evidence for this, and it is thought to have been an excuse for the following events. After being refused the supplies they desperately needed, the train headed west and camped at Mountain Meadows, where they thought they could rest a while and allow their stock to recover. Mountain Meadows is mostly sagebrush now, but at the time it was lush with grass and plenty of forage, and good water. My wife and I visited a few years ago. It was a little hard to find. There aren't a lot of signs directing you there. However, once you get there, things are all well marked. There's a monument built by the Mormon Church, and there are signs telling what happened there. While camped at Mount Meadows, the Baker Fancier party was attacked by the Nauvoo Legion, a Mormon militia and a group of Southern Paiute Indians. Both were led by Isaac C. Height and John D. Lee. The Mormons had tried to get the Paiutes to do it on their own so that they could blame them later, but the Paiutes were distrusting. The Mormons disguised themselves as Paiutes and did get at least some of them to go along with the attack. The train initially suffered some dead and wounded, but held out for 5 days. The siege ended up being successful for the Mormons, though, as the wagon train was starving and dying of thirst, and the wounded were suffering terribly. Finally, after being approached by the Mormons who were carrying a white flag, the train took a deal offered by the Mormons. The Baker Fancier party was to give up their weapons and surrender the Mormons, who would protect them from the Paiutes, and they would not be harmed. The party must have thought the Mormons were their saviors at this point and were willing to trust them to protect them from the Paiutes, who they believed were the ones attacking them. As they were marched out of camp, each member of the party had a Mormon by his or her side. They thought to protect them. But that was not to be. All 120 of the unarmed women, men, and older children were murdered in cold blood. The men were in the front of the line, and the women could hear the gunshots after the men disappeared over the rise. The women and children were next, and only 17 of the younger children were spared. These children were thought to be too young to be able to tell about what they had seen and were later handed off to Mormon families. Those children were eventually rescued and returned to their own families back east. Some of the children, as it turned out, were old enough to remember what had happened and talked about it later. The bodies were also either buried in shallow graves or left exposed to the wolves and the elements. The evidence was plain to see, but it took time for the truth to be discovered, mostly because the Civil War was raging back east. John D. Lee was the supposed leader of the massacre and was later tried and executed by firing squad. Lee was the stepson of Brigham Young and is thought to have been set up by the Mormon powers that were supposed to protect the church and Brigham Young. Whether or not Brigham Young ordered the attack is still a controversial subject. Before Lee's execution, he had been banished by Brigham Young in the hope that that would put an end to the pressure put on him by President Buchanan to admit he ordered the massacre himself. He was banished to what is now called Lee's Crossing to run a ferry across the Colorado River. Lee's Crossing is now the main entrance or put-in for people floating the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. The Danites were a Mormon vigilante group formed while the Mormons were settling in Missouri in 1830s. There is concrete evidence that they were originally sanctioned by Joseph Smith, but there is still disagreement among historians as to whether or not the group was sanctioned by the church at the time. The official stance of the modern Mormon church today is that the Danites existed for only 5 months and the rest is folklore. There is evidence, however, that the Danites committed ritualistic murders they called blood atonement through the 1850s. The question is whether or not the atrocities were sanctioned by Joseph Smith and later Brigham Young. No doubt there is a lot of myths surrounding the Danites and a lot of folklore, but not a lot of direct evidence tying them to either man once they were out of control. It is believed by historians that Brigham Young used Porter Rockwell, John D. Lee, and the Danites just as the mob used muscle. Porter Rockwell is another infamous character in Mormon history. He was known as the Destroying Angel and is thought to have killed more people than Wyatt Earp or Doc Holliday. And y'all, here's a picture of him. He's a freaky looking guy. Look at that. Look at that. But Masterson and Tom Horn combined. Excuse me. Yeah, well, let me say that again, y'all. I got the pages mixed up. This guy was thought to have killed more people than Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Bat Masterson, and Tom Horn combined. He was said to have eagle-like eyesight and could kill with a rifle from a long distance, making him terrifying since his victims didn't always see him coming. Again, the question is, were his actions sanctioned by Brigham Young, or was he a renegade? Certainly, Brigham Young and his church benefited from some of his actions. They also, however, paid from the backlash caused by his atrocities. Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram was murdered by a mob in Carthage, Illinois, while awaiting trial for rioting in 1844. Before settling in Salt Lake, the Mormons had already been forcibly expelled from New York, Missouri, Ohio, and Illinois. Mormon lives were ruined, houses burned, wealth lost. People starved and died from exposure. While it in no way excuses the massacre of the Baker Fancier party at Mount Meadows, it does explain why the Mormons might have been nervous about outsiders in their valley. This is just some of the history of the Mormon Church. Understanding it is interesting, and I find it helpful in many ways. The early Mormons' relationship with the native population in the Salt Lake Valley was volatile, to say the least. Brigham Young seemed to ally with them and use them when it was to his benefit or the church. He tried to manipulate them into attacking the Baker Fancier party so he could lay the blame on them later when news got to the rest of the country, which he must have known it surely would. Of course, that is not exclusive to the Mormon Church. Rather, it is typical of how the Native Americans were used and exploited by white people settling in the West. Some of the offshoots of the Mormon Church are what I find really interesting. These offshoots are in no way sanctioned by the Mormon Church, and in fact are denounced by the established Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the FLDS, is probably the most well-known religious sect or offshoot of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Most of its estimated 6,000 to 10,000 members live in Colorado City, Arizona, and the surrounding area. People who live there simply call it Short Creek or the Crick. It's an extremely remote desert area surrounded by beautiful red cliffs sitting right on the Arizona-Utah borders. I don't think anyone lives there who is not a member of the FLDS, or at least a past member who possibly has been kicked out of the church. There are apparently a lot of those exiled from the church, especially after Warren Jeffs took over the church, but they remain there because they don't understand life anywhere else. It is said that if you drive into town, you'll be followed by more than one lifted pickup truck with tinted windows, and you will possibly be harassed. Colorado City was way ahead of the rest of the country in terms of surveillance, having cameras placed all over town. The FLDS is based around polygamy or living the true doctrine of the Mormon Church, but child abuse and bleeding the beast has been proven to be front and center. Bleeding the beast is just a way of normalizing stealing from the taxpayers. A man will take several wives. One will be legal, the others are legally speaking single moms. As single moms, they're awarded tax dollars to help raise their children. In reality, the money they receive from the state goes into the family coffers. Of course, the percentage of single moms in the Crick is higher than anywhere else in the United States. Do you remember hearing about Warren Jeffs? He was all over the news back in the 2000s and on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. This is his town, and the FLDS is his church, even as he sits in jail serving a life sentence for child sexual assault. Before becoming the all-powerful prophet, he was the FLDS school principal and ruled with absolute authority. He was known to use a yardstick to spank the children until it broke. No one would question him or disagree in any way. Young boys who he had raped repeatedly had to keep sweet, in other words, keep their mouths shut. If they did try to tell someone about what was happening to them, they would not have been believed and they would have been severely punished by Warren Jeffs. It wasn't only his young victims who would suffer, but the victims' whole family. The property their houses were built on was owned by the church, and Jeffs was the absolute leader of the church and its property, so they could lose their homes, their standing in the community, and their whole family. A man would be excommunicated from the church by Warren Jeffs, his wives and children taken from him and given to another man. While on the run and on the FBI's most wanted list, Jeffs ordered each family in his flock to do whatever they had to do to come up with and send him $1,000 per week each. This was a lot to ask, as most of them had very little money and certainly none to spare. People did it, though, and that funded his time on the road. He traveled in a caravan of expensive SUVs and visited places like New Orleans during Mardi Gras, where he would experience life outside the creek. Life inside the creek was extremely stifling. Jeffs would dictate what people could wear, what color their clothes would be, and even the style of their hair. The women had to wear their hair in a pliego and wear plastic-colored prairie dresses. In a pliego, the hair would rise high above the forehead and then come back into a braid or braids. The men had to have their sleeves to the wrist and the top button buttoned. One never knew when Jeffs would receive a revelation and their lives would be further restricted. Jeffs made the mistake of thinking it would be a good idea to build a huge temple in El Dorado, Texas. Once he secured the land, he would order members of his flock to come live there, either to construct the temple or to add to the growing community he was building. If you were called to the temple, you went, even if you were an underage girl, and if it meant leaving your family. He called it the YFZ Ranch. YFZ stands for the Yearning for Zion. Everyone was expected to yearn for it, and everyone was expected to go if called upon, or give up your daughter or your wife if she were called upon, and you were expected to act like it was the biggest honor of your life. The FBI ended up raiding the ranch and found some really disturbing things there. Behind the altar, they found a secret room with a weird white bed. They also found a vault full of information about what went on in the rooms. Jeff would perform marriages with underage girls, some as young as 12. After the ceremony, they would be escorted into this room by Jeff's sister wives, where he would rape them. While this was happening, the sister wives kneeled on a kneeling platform attached to the bed. Some of the information they found in the vault was in the form of audio taped recordings of these sickening crimes. Now Jeff communicates with his flock over the phone from jail, but they still obey everything he says, probably still ignorant or at least unbelieving of his crimes. He talks in a quiet, monotone voice and sounds extremely creepy to me. Call the FLDS a church if you want, but Warren Jeffs is a cult leader and an extremely malignant, I can't even say the damn word, malignant, there you go, narcissist. Malignant narcissism is defined as someone who has a form of narcissism that is highly abusive. Malignant narcissists get a sense of satisfaction from hurting others and manipulate and lie to get what they want, no matter how much it may hurt someone. One can't really give Warren all the credit. Generations before him started the FLDS and conditioned its members before he came of age and inherited it from all his father, Rulon Jeffs. I'm not sure if he took it to a level or if the country was just ignorant of what was going on there before he came to power. They probably just got away with it before the advent of social media and the internet. Historically, police in the area tended to look the other way rather than have to face the challenge of confronting the problems in the creek. Plus, the police in the creek were owned by Warren Jeffs. It wasn't until the mid-2000s that authorities in Arizona and Utah were forced by public opinion to confront the lawlessness. Father Rulon did have 60 wives and 60 children when he died in 2002 at the age of 92. His death was a huge surprise to his flock. He was thought to be a true God who would live forever. They still think he speaks through Warren and that he will rise again someday. You may have heard of the lost boys in reference to the FLDS. If young men or teenagers really slip up at all, they're sent away and banished from the FLDS, the only community they ever knew, and their families. The lost boys usually end up in the Salt Lake City area and are forced to figure out life in a world they were shielded from their whole lives. In the FLDS, if boys and young men are not willing to fall in line and keep sweet, keep their mouths shut, and provide cheap labor without complaining, they are just excess males. Not only not needed, but in the way of the older men who prey on the young women and girls. Their whole foundation is ripped from under them, and they're literally on their own. The FLDS and its business front, the United Effort Plan, UEP, has construction businesses and use young men or boys for cheap labor. These are surprisingly large companies and do huge projects all over the country, including government contracted projects. They don't follow any of the labor laws, which make it easy for them to win bids on large projects. The UEP also owns all of the private land in Short Creek. People who build homes there must let them build them on UEP land. This has led to all kinds of confusion about who actually has rights to the houses built on the land. I'm not sure if it's still this way, but when Warren Jeffs lived in Short Creek before he was sent to prison, he would force families out of their homes using the local police as muscle when he expelled them from his church for whatever contrived reason he gave. Children in Colorado City go to school at the FLDS school and are taught only what the church wants them to be taught. Traditionally, young boys and girls have been sexually abused by the adults in charge of them, not just by Uncle Warren. A lot of times the family is aware of this abuse, but it helps with their standing in the community, so it is allowed to happen. It's amazing to me how many of these cults, based on prepping for the end of the world as we know it, are run by a man who really just wants money, power, and sex. And that man will do anything to get what he wants. For some reason, there seems to be a never-ending supply of people who believe the end times are at hand. I thought there would be some direct connection between Chad Daybell's doomsday cult and the FLDS, but nothing that came up in court and nothing I have read since directly ties the two. Even if there was no direct connection, a lot of the fundamentalist beliefs are the same. All powerful men and subservient women, all taxation is government theft, bleeding the beast, prophets speak directly to dead people, angels, and God. The original Mormon scripture is the only true religion. The latter means polygamy is not only okay, but you must have at least 3 wives to get to your celestial kingdom. The more wives and children you have, the higher your standing. I also thought there would be evidence that Chad Daybell's doomsday cult would be more of a sex cult. After all, most cults are at their core sex cults, but I didn't hear any evidence of that. I do still wonder about that. For more on Warren Jeffs and the FLDS, you might want to read Prophets Pray by Sam Brower. Another great book on Mormon fundamentalism is Under the Banner of Heaven by John Krakauer. I highly recommend both books. They are true accounts of actual events and actual people, and you couldn't come up with more dramatic, sadistic stories, even if you made it all up. There are several other splinter groups or offshoots of the Mormon Church: the Community of Christ, the Church of Jesus Christ, the Church of Christ with Elijah Message, to name a few. A more recent one is Denver Snuffer's Remnant, which is centered right here in Boise. Denver Snuffer, a lawyer, espouses that the Mormon church lost its way a long time ago, and his movement is a return to the original doctrine or covenant. The original doctrine, of course, includes polygamy, but Denver Snuffer doesn't seem to address that directly, at least not publicly. None of these cultist churches are in any way sanctioned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I look at the Mormon past kind of like our country's past. Remember slavery, the burning of witches in Salem, Massachusetts? Our country's history is extremely violent. Still, we need to study the past to understand how we got to where we are now. Hiding the past or acting like it never happened doesn't help and only makes it more likely that we'll repeat it. I have to say here that the vast majority of Mormons are Mormons because they appreciate the values of the church. Family values, patriotism and love of their country, conservatism, independence and self-reliance, support of and from your neighbors. Y'all, that's Opie back here probably fighting with the cat. So, come here, Opie. Come here. So I'm sorry, y'all. It's just me in my house here, and Opie's in there messing with Midnight. But let's see. Independence and self-reliance, support of and from your neighbors, following the law of our country, and of course, everything that goes with Christianity. Hold on, y'all. You get the best when you come to KJ and the Ray here. It's called life, y'all. Sorry. There's a huge contrast between these Mormons who work hard and take positions in our communities that require a big commitment and the ones that fall into the cult category. There are also many similar cults that have nothing to do with the Mormon Church. Do you know where the term drink the Kool-Aid came from? In Guyana in 1978, over 900 members of Jim Jones' People's Temple, men, women, and children, voluntarily drank a sweetened drink laced with cyanide. Actually, it's even worse. The children didn't want to drink it because it tasted bad, but they were forced by their parents. That cult believed that the American government was about to come and kill them all anyway, which absolutely was not true. At least not until Jones had his goons kill a congressman and 3 reporters on the airstrip in Guyana. Years of conditioning by a very powerful, convincing man had done its job. Jim Jones also had a system of rating people, although not as clear as Chad Daybell's. It was certain, though, that if you were a young, attractive woman and were willing to have sex with Jim Jones, your standing in the community would rise. Jonestown was based on socialist principles where each person should have been equal in spite of gender, race, etc. Black people, however, never seemed to climb the ladder. According to an article by Catherine B. Abbott and Rebecca Moore, there was no black leadership and no black staff. The People's Temple came to prominence in Redwood Valley, California, a very small community about 100 miles north of San Francisco, connected to it by the 101 highway. As a young man, I lived not far from Redwood Valley, but like most people there, I had no idea about the People's Temple, what was happening there, or about Jim Jones. Jones' minefield was the San Francisco ghetto. He and his minions were able to recruit hundreds of black laborers to work the fields of Jonestown. It must have seemed like a step up to them, an opportunity to work hard and benefit from their labors, the promise of equality for all, and after all, they didn't have a lot to lose. Jim Jones and the People's Temple had a huge following, and Jones was very influential in the 1960s and 70s. He was thought to have a close relationship with President Carter and was even thought to have his own path to the presidency. However, he rejected political life in favor of his church. Also, Jones claimed to be a faith healer. He would heal people in his church for everyone to see. He claimed to pull cancerous growths out of them. He would do this right in front of hundreds of congregants. It was later shown that he used bloody chicken parts. He would have people who supposedly were crippled and couldn't walk come into the church where he would restore their ability to walk. all so obviously contrived, but the followers believed it, and even those who didn't were afraid to say so. He would have people give him information about congregants, and he would claim right in front of them in church that God told him something about them, and the victims believed him. In one instance, he told an elderly lady that her husband had been in an accident, but would survive his injuries. The truth was that Jim Jones had talked to her husband's doctor and gleaned this information from him. However, Jim Jones could not have done it all on his own. His wife, Marceline, was by his side the whole way. She didn't like the fact that Jones had several mistresses, but she was unwilling to give up her position in the church. Carolyn Layton and Maria Casares held particularly powerful positions in the church and were thought to have played an important role in convincing the followers to commit suicide. Layton even had a child with Jim Jones. Everyone has heard of Charles Manson and the Manson family. When I see Lori Daybell's face now, it is iconic and evil to me as that of Charles Manson. Charles Manson with the wild eyes and swastika on his forehead, Lori Daybell with her head turned to the side, her wavy hair covering her face. Charles Manson was the ultimate cult leader in the 1960s. He was also a doomsday cult, but he also used drugs like LSD to enhance his influence over his followers. He espoused an imminent apocalyptic race war between whites and blacks and was a white supremacist. People who were around Manson at the time said he was extremely charismatic, and people, especially young, malleable women, were drawn to him. He attracted large groups of followers and crowds wherever he spoke. He targeted emotionally insecure social outcasts. He used drugs and prostitution to influence them. They probably didn't know about his past. He had spent a lot of his adult life in prison, been married twice, and had a couple of kids running around who he took no responsibility for, even though they both shared his name. A few of his followers who you may have heard of include musician Charles Tex Watson, porn actor Bobby Bessel, and Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who attempted to assassinate President Ford in 1975 in Sacramento, California. Other prominent people in his cult who you may have heard of are Leslie Van Houten, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel. In 1969, actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, and 4 other people were ritualistically murdered in her home in the canyons above Hollywood. The following day, Leno and Rosemary LaBanca was murdered. These murders were high profile and had a lot of attention. Manson's followers who committed the murders were brutal and totally unfeeling for their victims. They left messages like "Helter Skelter" and "Kill the pigs" on the walls using the blood of their victims. They were trying to blame the murders on the Black Panthers, a militaristic group standing up for the rights of black people. Manson's idea was that the murders would get the ball rolling on race wars he thought were coming anyway. He was also extremely ticked off at the Hollywood elite, who he thought were ignoring his obvious talent as a musician. Shortly before these murders, Manson had befriended Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. Wilson seemed to have been attracted to the free love practiced by the family, and I'm sure some of the Manson's young female followers. He even allowed the Manson family to live in his home for a while, sharing everything he had with them until it got to be too much. That seemed to be okay with Manson. He just moved on to his next victim, moving his family to the Spain ranch where they were living when they committed the atrocious murders. Similar to the murders committed by Lori Daybell, Manson was not present at the actual crime scenes, but was later charged and convicted of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Manson was still influential even while in prison until he died of colon cancer in 2017. Have you ever heard of the Indian guru Bhagwan Sri Raja and his commune in Antelope, Oregon? In the 1970s, he ran a commune and espoused free love orgies, peace, compassion, and sexual inhibition. Even after the Summer of Love in 1967, sex outside of marriage and sex for anything other than making babies was taboo in most of American culture. But with the advent of the birth control pill, people were hungry for any chance to explore their sexuality. The commune attempted to take control of the local government through sheer numbers of voters. They recruited the bussed-in homeless people to fill their ranks and the ballot boxes. Antelope was extremely conservative ranching community, and this caused a battle between local ranchers and the commune. When the attempt to take over the local government failed, members of the commune attempted to poison the community by tainting the salad bar at a local restaurant. Dozens suffered from salmonella poisoning. The Bhagwan also had help. Sheila, a young Indian woman, ran the commune and actually ordered the attempted poisoning of the Bhagwan's doctor. She was dedicated to the cause and had a lust for power. It's easy to see how gullible his followers were. There is surviving footage showing them falling all over themselves when he showed up at the commune in one of his 19 gold-plated Rolls Royces, paid for, of course, by his followers, who had to hand over all of their earthly possessions and wealth to the Bhagwan. Some of his followers were successful doctors and lawyers. I'll never understand how that happened. The supposedly peaceful commune stockpiled a massive amount of weapons and ammo, preparing to take on the U.S. government, who they were sure would be coming. The similarities between all of these cults can't be ignored. An extremely charismatic male leader, a power-hungry woman behind him, supposed sexual freedom, usually meaning the male leader having multiple partners, socialism, doomsday imminent, and the evil U.S. government coming to get them. All of this adds up to these cult leaders justifying all kinds of horrible behavior, just as it does for Lori and Chad. It also raises questions in my mind about why there were so many weak-minded people who are willing to give their lives over and follow these cult leaders. What are they lacking in their lives that leads them to need such questionable leadership? Is it a need to be dominated? Is it a fetish? Do they simply need someone to tell them what to do on a day-to-day basis? Is it a way to check out on the real world and its responsibilities? I really don't know. All right, y'all. We'll get back with the next part. That was awful long. It's a big amount of information to take in. Leave your comments and keep on looking.